Hi, everybody. Welcome to my first conversation. And I'm very happy to have my good friend, mentor, and colleague, Anand Vaidya, here. Anand is a professor of philosophy at San Jose State University. His research is absurdly broad, so I won't bother to try and list it all out. If you're interested in knowing more about his research, you can Google him, and he is quite prolific. And I feel very fortunate to have you here, Anand. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks for inviting me, Sean.
Yeah, so the question that I want to talk to you about today, I think, is a timely one. It's an important question. It's what I've been thinking about a lot in the context of two areas. One area is, our mutual research in classical Indian philosophy, and I think perhaps more importantly, frankly, in the context of the pandemic and the collective action problems that we face in the context of the pandemic. And so the question is the following: how can we understand the important differences that there must be, that I hope there is, between what we might call a fallacious appeal to authority, what's sometimes called the argument from authority, which is seen as a poor argument on the one hand, and a rational trust of authoritative expertise on the other. We are obviously all finite and need to rely on authorities and experts to make intelligent decisions about how to behave. So how can we distinguish between appeals to authority that are problematic, maybe rationally and ethically problematic on the one hand, and appeals to authority that are morally and rationally wholesome and skillful? So again, I mentioned at the outset that there's sort of two contexts in which this works, and I mentioned those because this question has quite a deep historical origin. One of the main divides in classical Indian philosophy, which is arguably the oldest tradition of philosophy on the planet, is an attempt on the part of orthodox schools of thought to distance themselves from those the non-orthodox schools, to distinguish themselves from orthodox schools by rejecting the textual authority of the Vedas. And much dispute evolves in the Indian tradition around trying to understand when an appeal to authority is grounded. What is a textual authority? What is an epistemic authority? But fast forward 2,500 years or so, and here we are today, being told quite explicitly by what I'm going to say is the lion's share of medical professionals that the right thing for us all to do is to get vaccinated to prevent the spread of, COVID-19 and all of its, variegated variants. And so for me, it's a really urgent question because there is a lot of vaccine hesitancy, there's a lot of skepticism, a lot of debate, a lot of ruined family dinners. And what I want to know, and I'm very confident that you can help me and help us try and figure this out a little bit, is how do we start to distinguish between appeals to authority that are pernicious in some way and appeals to authority that are skillful, prudent, rational, wise. So I know you have thoughts on this. So that's sort of the framework within which I'm hoping we can conduct our conversation. But I want to, just with that sort of opening salvo in place, hear from you about what you think about this question and how we can sort of pick away at it as philosophers do.
Okay, thank you, Sean. I agree. That's a very relevant and important question right now. And it also, it's really delightful to see you approach this question by looking at it historically in terms of something that is deep within the history of philosophy. And I agree with you that one of the core places in which we can see the relevance of an aspect of this question, if not one of the core components of it, is by looking at the classical debate between the orthodox and the heterodox traditions in classical Indian philosophy. But I also think, and I'm sure you're aware of this too, that we can find this sort of question also in the deep history of medieval philosophy and Western philosophy as well. We're going to find it. We're going to find it in a lot of places, actually. It's not something that is just something in just one tradition. And another thing to look at here is just that the ideas that we're talking about with respect to appealing to authority and appealing to someone, and when is it good and bad to do this, these are pretty much things that are going to apply to every culture where there are those that are the elders or the wise ones, and when do we appeal to them and when do we not. So I think it's very good that you're looking at this in that frame. I like that frame myself, and I think it's very important to look at that. I might begin by first saying, without talking about it at length at this point, that the other frame to introduce here is not only to be sensitive to cross-cultural and historical issues, but to look at the actual research in the sciences on expertise and what it means to talk about expertise as studied by psychologists. So there is research on this material and what it means to say you're an expert in a given domain. So I think at some point I want to talk a little bit about that. But the point of departure for me in this question is a very large frame. And I think it's one that our audience can benefit greatly from. So I'm going to introduce two concepts that I think are very helpful when we think about this question. And also the concepts apply to other questions as well in the areas that you're talking about. So here's the two concepts and the distinction that I want to draw out. On the one hand, I want to locate a notion called an epistemic culture. And I'm going to define an epistemic culture by talking about the epistemic sources that members of the culture take to be valid sources. You yourself might recognize that this is itself comes straight out of the classical Indian tradition, but again, it's also in Western philosophy. So I want to talk about an epistemic culture, and I want to talk about what it means for an epistemic culture to hold or believe that certain sorts of sources are good sources. So I'm going to list a couple of sources. I'm going to pick three right now. One of them is testimony, another one is perception, and another one is inference. So for example, there's many more, and I'll mention them shortly, but at least for now, I think our audience will understand these, seeing and hearing things, then the significance of the specific auditory perception known as testimony, and then the intellectual sort of conceptual inference patterns that we look at when we make inferences that we think are good or bad, such as deductive or inductive. So I think this is one important thing to talk about. And so we might mistakenly believe that there's only one epistemic culture. And so this leads to an obvious problem, because when we think there's only one epistemic culture, we're unable to understand how someone can be approaching the same issue that we're talking about and not have the same conclusions we have. This oftentimes leads to dogmatism when you cannot understand differences in epistemic cultures. So I think it's very important to have that notion on the table. The other one is closely related, but it can shift somewhat. And that's the notion of an epistemic self. And that's the idea that an individual, although they belong to an epistemic culture and was raised in an epistemic culture, might have their own beliefs or attitudes about appealing to certain things in terms of how much they think those things are worth. So it might be the case that two people belong to an epistemic culture where they take testimony to be a valid source. However, one person within the epistemic culture doesn't really take the validity of testimony to be that good that often, or sort of downplays testimony as compared to firsthand perceptual information. So this is a way in which there can be a shared epistemic culture, but a differentiation between epistemic agents within the epistemic culture. So collectively, what we have is kind of this. We have different epistemic cultures, and then we have epistemic agents, each with an epistemic self, some of which are part of the same epistemic culture, but may differ subtly about some aspect of the epistemic culture. And I prefer this way of doing it than the narrow one, where an epistemic culture maps one-to-one with epistemic selves being identical, because I think it's not true to the facts about the way the world is, right? So when scientists disagree with one another, they may in fact share an epistemic culture, but disagree from a perspective of an epistemic agent having a different epistemic self, right? So those two distinctions, I think, are very helpful. And because we are primarily talking about your question in the frame of when is it good to appeal to authority, I think what we need to think about is the question of why one group might believe it's good to appeal to this given authority and another one might disagree. And I think one of the ways in which we can analyze that is by thinking through the framework that I talk through, which is the epistemic culture and the epistemic self. I think that's a helpful way of having vocabulary that can definitely guide people to understand and communicate with each other in a more authentic way that gets at an issue they care about, because what they are talking about is, oh, okay, so in your epistemic culture, what is the thing that you're appealing to that you think brings authority, and why someone should feel comfortable appealing to that? And from another epistemic culture, it might be the case that it's just not true that that's the kind of thing that can be appealed to. And I think this is, so let me just close this opening comment with this distinction by just tying it into what you said. This is precisely what the debate is between the Orthodox and the heterodox. And they're saying, look, I don't want to, read the Vedas and make all my theories consistent with it. I'm a Jain. And then here comes, I'm Mimamsaka, and he says, well, I'm doing precisely this, and I'm trying to actually give an interpretation. But a Mimamsaka does not agree with the Nyayaka about everything. So clearly, the epistemic self embodied in Kumarila Bhatta and Gautama Aksapada is not the same, though they share, in some sense, they share a common epistemic culture, which Hemachandra of the Jain tradition doesn't share.
Good. Thank you for that. So I really like this nomenclature. I find it very helpful. And I think one of the interesting things about this question as it plays out in a more contemporary context is that even if we stipulate for the sake of exploration that we're all living in a relatively homogeneous epistemic culture where testimony, perception, and inference are, have some validity as knowledge sources, and I think that's reasonable. That's a reasonable starting place for a conversation of this sort. As distinct epistemic selves within a culture that has certain, valid sources of knowledge, we can come to radically different conclusions just in virtue of how we might rank order those sources as being better or worse than each other. And even more frightening for my money anyway is that even if we agree that testimony, for example, which I think is the most relevant one here, is a reasonable source, look at how different we can be in our conclusions based on which sources of testimony we take seriously. So even if we stipulate for the sake of argument that you and I are two epistemic selves that agree that the epistemic authorities that we can advert to in our epistemic culture are correct, testimony, perception, and inference. And even if we both agree that perception is the most authoritative because it gives us direct access to reality, inference is the second most authoritative because it generates conclusions on the basis of reasons to which we can apply the scrutiny of logical norms, and testimony is acceptable insofar as the testimonial sources have the right kind of authority. Even if we have those agreements, we can still then generate radically different conclusions about things when we disagree about where the testimonial sources are. So not to be too cheeky about it, but for someone like me, I'm going to base my decision-making processes around vaccines based on the medical authorities and peer-reviewed science articles that conclude that this is the best way to fight the pandemic. That's sort of my, foundation for thinking about testimonial authority here. But some folks who say have, skeptical worries on the basis of the problematic commodified relationship between the pharmaceutical industry and the healthcare industry, the number of times I've been sent YouTube videos by people who are like, check this out, right? Like, this is super important. I'm like, why No, it's not. you know, so for me, and so I guess the worry here is that even as we bootstrap these categories, we can stipulate quite a bit of overlap between two individuals in terms of their place in the culture, in terms of the way they would hierarchically rank order their epistemic authorities within a culture. And even then, we still are going to be stomping our feet, because if I take one testimonial source as valid and you have some skeptical worry that causes you to dismiss it in principle, then you might take some other testimonial source as valid. And what kind of influence does that have over what becomes perceptually salient and inferentially conspicuous? Right? So this is the philosophical worry that I have, is that once we are in the territory of having disputes about testimonial authority, the impact that those authorities can have over how we perceive things, which for us has a kind of directness to it, and how we reason about things. Because obviously, as you know, as an epistemologist, what counts as epistemically or inferentially conspicuous for reasoning is going to be the result of psychological processes that are ignoring a whole bunch of things, because we're finite. We can only think and see certain amounts of the world. And so our brains and our bodies are, in a subpersonal way, always helping us intelligently ignore huge swaths of information. But if I get my testimonial authorities wrong or right, the influence of those authorities, which I'm going to take as granted, over how I see, how I spontaneously perceive my environment, and how I think about it, that's a perspectival circle. It can be very difficult to penetrate, deconstruct, or reorient in the face of countervailing evidence of any sort. Because part of what happens when my perceptual apparatus and my inferential apparatus are working together to construct an epistemic perspective, I'm ignoring a lot of things. And so that's sort of the philosophical worry that comes to mind for me when I think about how these categories can help us sort of, clarify the problem space. But now the problem becomes even more powerfully salient.
Sean, you're absolutely right. I mean, the problem here is that as you dive into the problem, it appears first like we're asking just this question about how, in fact, do we determine, or like, let's just use a concept, the demarcation question. How do we demarcate precisely these appeals to authority that are good from these appeals to authority that are bad? And then as you dig into it, you start to discover, wait a minute, I thought I was just asking that question, and now it turns out I'm asking a much larger question, a question that goes into the philosophy of mind and into the philosophy of psychiatry and neuroscience as I think about the nature of the self and how that is created and how that thing epistemically gains and accesses information in the first place through attention. I think you're absolutely correct that it's going to appear that the question is in one domain, but it's a mistake to think that you can just stay there and answer the question coherently without exploring the other aspects of the other sources in conjunction with it. And that leads to a kind of a circle. But before I address more about that, I want to sort of bring out some of the things that you mentioned and some other distinctions that are very important here that people should know about. First of all, and just regarding the question, it's important to remind people that the appeal to authority is properly classified both in classical Indian philosophy and in Western philosophy in the area of an informal fallacy. And it's very oftentimes forgotten what that means. What did we mean when we said that? Informal fallacy means not that it's not rigorous, it means that the fallacy doesn't pertain to the form alone. That's what it means to say it's informal. But what does that really mean? That means that unlike a formal fallacy, like affirming the consequent or denying the antecedent, there is no algorithm that can give us the answer precisely for what the mistake is. And it would be somewhat foolhardy to think that our discussion is going to lead to that exact answer. We would not be understanding what Aristotle was teaching us. And I think here Aristotle is correct, actually. So I think what's important to recognize is that we need to become more aware of the factors that we should be assessing to figure out whether or not something is an instance of the error kind of appeal to authority versus a good and a safe appeal to authority. So strictly speaking, also, we want to be careful here about how we tie out the fallacy. Strictly speaking, the fallacy isn't an appeal to authority. The fallacy is the appeal to unqualified authority. That's what the fallacy is, right? So, but this is close enough to the question you're asking that it becomes relevant to just say, when is appealing to an authority an error of a certain kind? And I'm just trying to drive out the point that we ought not look at this algorithmically. We need to look at the factors that are relevant for a more critical engagement. So that's point number one about that. Then another distinction that I think is relevant from what you said also pertains to actually thinking about not the source coming from the agent, such as perception, testimony, something they hear, or inference, but the source from where it is outside, like, for example, the Center for Disease Control. That's a source of information that's relevant here. So in epistemology, both in classical India and contemporary analytic epistemology, we like to make a distinction between what is known as overriding and undercutting defeaters. And this is an extremely useful distinction. Also, like the cultures and the self and sources, this piece of applied epistemology is something I wish more people in public spheres would learn to use correctly and use in debates with one another. So as I use the distinction, and as I think many people in Western analytical philosophy use the distinction, if someone from the CDC reports something about vaccines and I have an overriding defeater, that's a defeater that says, given what evidence they presented, this piece of evidence is a countering piece of evidence that overrides the argument for what they're saying. So an overriding defeater takes out the justification for a claim by overriding the evidence that's given for the claim. But importantly, it does not say that the CDC is just a bunch of garbage and that we should never listen to anything coming from the CDC, okay? That's called an undermining defeater. That's when you say that some kind of source is fundamentally messed up and there's nothing good coming out of it. One way to think about this is just through a reliability metric, right? So an undermining source is one that is so grossly unreliable that it's not worth taking anything seriously, right? There are other ways of talking about it where you don't talk so much about reliability, but you talk about the fact that it's not really a probative source at all. It's not giving evidence. It's not in the evidential business at all. It's doing something else. So one of the big debates that I'm very interested in this area where overriding and undermining come in, or undercutting where it comes in, is on the status and the nature of intuition. So if someone was to say, I have the intuition that we shouldn't use vaccines, one group of people would say, well, intuition is not a source of evidence. There's a lot of ways in which intuition has been undermined. It's not like it's overriding a piece of evidence. It's been undermined. The source just doesn't work at all. And then another group will say, no, it's not true that it's undermined. But in the case of vaccine, it would be odd for someone, I think, to say, that my reason for not taking vaccines is just I have a hunch, right? I have a hunch and I have an intuition that basically they won't do anything, right? Okay, so those distinctions I think are very relevant for assessing the question we're asking with respect to testimony we might receive from a source. So, for example, you and I share an epistemic culture, and we are maybe differing in our epistemic selves subtly. But when we look, for example, at information coming from the CDC, we might both be saying, look, the evidence that we hear, we're going to believe because we don't have any overriding defeaters for the CDC. But we don't necessarily entertain the question of there being undermining evidence because we give authority to the institution itself, right? So that's a way in which this is relevant. So some people who don't share our epistemic culture or don't have the same epistemic selves with respect to how they look at the CDC might be saying, well, I just think that the CDC is just corrupt because of the very point you drove through, because it's just in the cahoots with the pharmaceutical. There's some capitalistic enterprise going on. So I don't take what they're saying at all seriously. I no longer take them to be a source at all, as opposed to this other thing where we're looking at it from the lens of Is there overriding information? Okay, so now I want to throw in one last piece here that's extremely important. So important that about 10 years ago, I guess now it is, I wrote a big paper on this topic because it's very, very important. So this is about the very issue of whether or not you should be at all entertaining, critically thinking about testimonial evidence from authorities. So this is an actual issue. So I get testimonial information from the CDC. Should I be critically thinking and aiming to assess in the sense of whether or not there's any overriding information for it at all? Should I even be doing that? And there turns out that a philosopher named Michael Huemer has an argument for why you shouldn't, why you shouldn't be doing this. This is the argument that's well known in the literature as the argument against critical thinking. And the claim is that critical thinking is epistemically irresponsible. And it's a very quick argument to give for why and it'll actually shape our debate in a very interesting way. You'll see how the other distinctions, undercutting and overriding, come in once I draw out this argument. So the argument that Michael Huemer gives is basically an application of what is known as the Condorcet jury theorem. So if you're not familiar with this, the fundamental idea, putting the mathematics aside, is that if you have a panel of experts, let's say you have 5 experts, and each of them have a greater than 50% chance of being right, then summing, taking the weighted sum of their votes on a policy issue is authority. That's basically the right way to go, because hey, you're not an expert. No one else is as good as an expert as these people. And if they all agree on something, what's it to you? What are you going to critically think about? So Michael Huemer argues that in several cases, it just seems odd to be engaging in critical thinking, because what could you possibly provide that is not going to happen or going to counter in an overriding sense what these people say? And so this is an application of a very famous theorem, the Condorcet jury theorem, and he applies in the context. I actually wrote a very long paper arguing that he's dead wrong, and I gave several reasons why he's wrong, but those things aren't actually really relevant right now. What's really relevant is just how this shapes the way we think about it, right? So some people might be thinking that what they're trying to do is provide evidence as why you shouldn't listen to the CDC. Or someone who is actually a medical scientist might be thinking, well, I know the people on that panel, and maybe they're more expertise than me because of their prestige of their institution, but I do have enough scientific training in this area to give countervailing information. So there are some scientists, for example, who have challenged the authority of certain scientific bodies. These people come from established schools. They don't sit on the panel, but in fact, they have relevant information. And so what are we looking at there? We're looking there not at undermining evidence, we're looking at overriding, right? So when one expert criticizes another expert panel, that's an instance of trying to say, right, maybe this person doesn't have a better than 0.5 probability of being right, and that they're an expert because I have overriding evidence about what's going on. There are several ways in which we do this. We try to replicate experiments, right? Replication is a way of saying, hey, this wasn't just localized to one area. So we already look within scientific cultures as an epistemic enterprise at techniques they have for making things more robust. So I think these distinctions are very useful in thinking about how to answer this question, because I think sometimes what we're looking for are 3 different components in this question. 1, who are the authorities? Okay. Number 2, when they were giving their authoritative testimony about what's the right thing to do, were they performing their authority? Was their authority actually present in their performance? And this is a problem that not many people realize, so I'll come back to it. And then the third thing is, what does their authority amount to in their expertise? So for example, the difference between an expert in telling you about stocks and the weather versus an expert in psychiatry about diagnosing versus an expert in epidemiology. Are all those types of expertise the same, right? So obviously in your case, you're dealing with the pandemics, you're dealing with expertise in a more specific area of inquiry within the sciences. But it's important to keep in mind that what we mean by expertise might shift as we shift the domain. So I think these are the 3 components that matter. So I'll close this portion of my commentary by just talking about the second component, which a lot of people are unaware of, which is called the performance problem for expertise. It's not a well-documented problem in the literature, but once I describe it to you, you'll see very quickly how it's relevant. So in being an expert and giving expert testimony, what we want is actually a coordination between two things. We want the expertise that the person has to be spoken for and performed so that what we have is an expert performance. Okay, what does that mean? It means that when, for example, we ask the leading epidemiologists, for example, about something related to vaccines or the spread of this disease, that at the moment that they're giving their answer, they're actually moving from their expertise. They're not, in fact, for example, here's a really dumb example, but they're not actually suffering from a hangover from the night before and sort of fumbling their way through the interview because they don't want to be embarrassed. And then because they're ashamed of what they say, they don't care to correct themselves. That's a kind of way in which virtue epistemology creeps in. We want our experts to be virtuous in their testimony. And this is very important because their expert testimony is useless to it unless it's an expression of their expertise. So sometimes people stay so focused on, I don't think that they're an expert, instead of just staying focused on the question whether, oh, I agree they're an expert, but was that an expert performance? Right? That's what we want. We want that. We want that, right? And so that has to be brought out with a certain degree. That's a problem that's actually relevant to the question you're asking as well, because sometimes there's a confusion about whether an appeal to authority is good or not based on whether or not people think that the person has some background that can make them an authority, but whether or not their performance was an expert performance.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you for that. I wanted to see if you think there's one other piece here that I wanted to add into this part of the conversation, because one of the ways that this relationship between an expert giving an expert performance comes to be challenged or seen as suspect is when the information base upon which the expert is drawing is ambiguous.
Yeah.
And so in the context of the pandemic, I can speak as a parent for a moment and say that the way in which children being put in and out of school, it gives whiplash, right? It's very confusing. And so I wonder when the suggestions that are being made, when the policies that are being developed and implemented are changing so rapidly, it's easy, I think, to come to the conclusion that these rapidly shifting changes are a reason to question the authority in an undermining defeater kind of way.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Where we think we can't trust them. They can't get their story straight, right?
Because inconsistency after a while leads to this very issue. Yes.
But the problem is, taking the side of our medical authorities for just a moment, is that like evolution, right? The evolution of this virus, the rate at which it is mutating in response to its host environment, the increase in its rate of infection, the resistance it quickly builds to the vaccine regimens that have already been implemented is rapid. And so the question I'm asking myself right now is how, it's a more specific version of the general question that we've started with, which is, how can I know when rapidly changing policy markers are in touch with a rapidly changing situation, or are an indication of someone being inadequate to the task assigned to them?
Right.
And this becomes especially important when we recognize that what we're being told is not just coming from the mouths of medical authorities. It's coming from the mouths of politicians who are making choices selectively about what medical perspectives they're going to take on and which they aren't. And so this is another place where that skepticism starts to creep in, because what we're being told changes very quickly. And the bureaucratic complexity through which the message is being delivered, media-wise, and at the interface between the medical professions and the politics and the corporations that are providing the actual vaccines for us, that is a very complicated triad of authority. Mm-hmm. And when the messaging that we receive is changing so quickly, it can be very discombobulating. And so the charitable read of that is like, well, we have to give you changing information and changing policy directives because the facts are changing so quickly. Yeah. And that seems reasonable, at least at a certain level of abstraction. But psychologically, we're all 2 years in, and we're just tired and sad and confused a lot of the time, which it makes it much more challenging psychologically to know, like, are these guys just incompetent, or are they just running to keep up with nature?
Good. I mean, Sean, I find that statement to be extremely important. And also, I think it just captures like another epistemic distinction that's extremely relevant here and exactly on that issue, which is it's the best bet view, which is saying, okay, so what we have going on is a situation that we need to tackle. And it looks to us as if the people who we would normally want to give high credence to in solving a problem are giving us information that leads to us wanting to say something is not going well here. It's giving us, as you were right to point out, kind of like a feeling that now we have undermining evidence because of gross inconsistency. And inconsistency makes us think either that the experts don't agree, so we don't get the Condorcet-Jury theorem off the ground. And in addition, we have this problem where we start to think, okay, maybe they're just not really rational in terms of like the answers they're giving. It's overly politicized because of the sort of angle of trying to get through the media and through the political agencies that are not on the ground side of the actual science that's doing the research. And so this leads to this problem. But then again, this is where the epistemic, but then again, we think, okay, but what is our best bet? Do we all of a sudden now think that reading a sacred text is going to be the alternative that we turn to in order to find guidance on the pandemic? I mean, so when you have a different epistemic culture, you might think, okay, well, you know, this isn't really going really well, and I actually have in my epistemic culture the idea that we can appeal to this text, and so this text says do this, you know, or my ancient wisdom says do this, and so that's something very different than what's being said by the medical professionals. And so there's some people in a group who are like, hey, I don't have that in my epistemic culture, so basically my best bet is just turning to this, and even if it looks bad what they're saying, I don't have an alternative in my epistemic culture to turn to, and the things that you're pointing to are just not part of my epistemic culture. But if you're in a different epistemic culture, then it starts to look a little bit different, because it's not the case anymore that you're just looking at that thing in the first place anyway. You're looking at it, and maybe your degree of deference to it is high enough for certain reasons, but it's not the only thing there. So after a while, when it starts to look like it's inconsistent and something that should be undermined and not appealed to at all, or it's not working out, or your experience goes contrary to what's being said, you might, well, maybe I'll just appeal to another thing in my epistemic culture. And that, I think that's leads to part of the issue that gets polarization off the ground, right? So one group of people just don't have another thing in their epistemic culture to appeal to, so they have to stick with the best bet within their tool, within their set of tools, and that's going to be the scientific enterprise. But for other people who have ancient wisdom or some sacred text, they might just be like, okay, well, I have another way to go, and so there becomes polarization, and this becomes a big problem here, because this issue then pulls people apart, but they're now trying to adjudicate an issue as if they can in an epistemic fashion, because throwing something from one epistemic culture that is disjoint from another epistemic culture cannot lead to reconciliation. If they don't share epistemic cultures, it's very hard to see how this will happen. So again, now let me bring in another distinction that's going to help here with this issue, which is the distinction between the epistemic view of argumentation and the manipulation view of
Mhm.
argumentation. Or I shouldn't be so negative. We should call it the non-epistemic view of argumentation to leave it more open what could be going on. But basically in the epistemic view, the trading of reasons in argumentation, or sorry, the trading of assertions, because they might not be taken to be reasons by both groups, right? So the trading of assertions has a way of leading to a better epistemic position, either for both parties or for the conjunction of the two parties. That's basically the goal of the way of seeing things from the epistemic view of argumentation. But then in some certain non-epistemic views, a lot of what's going on is that there is a kind of pulling and tugging. I'm trying to pull a group over onto my side. So we can illustrate this very nicely. So you can imagine someone from an epistemic culture that includes ancient wisdom and sacred texts, and one that only accepts the authority of the medical sciences for something like the vaccine and for something like a pandemic at this degree. And then you can imagine the group from the epistemic culture that includes ancient wisdom and sacred texts arguing with members from the group that does not have ancient wisdom and sacred texts, saying, look, well, look, where is your project going? It doesn't seem to me like it's going that well for you. It doesn't seem that well it's going for everyone. Why don't you come and join mine? This isn't an argument. The way this discussion goes, it's not really an argument about saying that, you know, we're providing overriding evidence or undermining evidence, really. And all we're trying to say is, look at where things are for you. Why isn't it better to just come over here, right? I feel like there's less epistemic stuff going on there than when two people debate whether or not a specific vaccine has been tested enough times, for example, and whether or not the emergency authorization of the use of a vaccine is really going to help, given that it didn't go through the stricter testing. That's a very different debate that has to do with overriding evidence concerning a very specific method, and that's something different than what's going on here. So I think those are two different things that we should keep in mind about how this polarization gets off the ground. Now, the issues about like the whiplash and all of those things, I think those have very powerful feelings, because you talked about the psychological effect. And so we should be sensitive here that what happens is it's not just an issue of trust, but it's an issue of psychological exhaustion. Because remember, one of the key things that's required for any epistemic enterprise is the use of attention, as you were pointing to earlier. Attention is a key factor, and the ability to accurately get information and assess it. But if one person or a group of people are constantly being sent information that puts them in a state of some kind of cognitive dissonance of a certain kind, their ability to attend and assess after too many iterations of that is just going to go down. Your attention will just not stay optimal for assessing stuff after enough times of getting this sort of effect. So the psychological situation of the average person in society having to listen to this, make decisions, and deal with like a family life in a very difficult situation is very hard. And to then think that they can accurately, critically think and exercise their attention in a way that's very powerful seems highly compromised, right? And so, yeah, so this is a double compounding problem. It's like they're appealing to authority of a relevant kind for help, but then at the same time, they're in a situation where, because of the nature of how they're being helped, they're losing their ability to psychologically attend the right way. And so they're just starting to decline in their epistemic endeavors. Yeah, so I think that's extremely relevant here.
So I want to just make sure we have one of these. I think there's a distinction that was implicit in what you just said, and I want to make it explicit and then ask a kind of practical question about how to, you know, help me out, help others out in light of that. So the distinction is between a kind of polarization that we see happening between people who might have different epistemic authorities in mind, right? So say I'm a person who in the context of you know, medical problem, whether it's the pandemic and vaccines, or whether it's even potentially something more radical, like folks who deny their children medical care because they see that their divine authority or their holy text says that they shouldn't do that, versus someone who's more on the side of taking medical authority at face value and doing what those authorities tell them to do. I find that particular level of polarization less philosophically interesting for very dogmatic reasons. namely that anybody who makes medical decisions on the basis of a religious text is like someone I'm not taking seriously as an epistemic agent. Like that for me is a reason to not engage with them.
You think they're not an epistemic peer?
That's right. Thank you. I'm just like, so, and that's just me putting my cards on the table. So for me, I'm like, that's a less interesting, so someone says, don't worry, Jesus is going to take care of me through this pandemic. I'm like, I'm not taking you very seriously. But there's a whole, that's one kind of polarization that happens. But another one that happens is when people actually agree that the testimony of experts is important. We just have a disagreement about where the expertise lies. So one really interesting example of this that's happening right now is that one of the research scientists who's responsible for, laying down the theoretical foundations of the particular kinds of vaccines that we have, the mRNA vaccine. That kind of vaccine is new, right? It's new technology. It's a new approach to vaccination. And one of the scientists who's responsible for publishing data on this and theorizing about it at the outset, years ago, has been strongly vocally opposed to the widespread implementation of these vaccines. Now, to be clear, as far as I know, the development of these kinds of vaccines has not been the province of one individual. It's been thousands of medical professionals. But this one individual was very much there at the ground floor. And so because this person has sort of distanced themselves in various ways from how these vaccines have been rolled out and how widespread they are, this is then taken by many, including some friends of mine, as like decisive evidence. Right, that this is the we are under the sway of a pharmaceutical takeover of healthcare, and that even the people who invented this technology are against it, right, in some ways. And so it gets very tricky in there, right?
That is I want to address that specific version of the issue. I just want to backtrack a little bit.
Please
to clarify something. It is relevant, just laying your cards on the table, to say you don't take someone to be an epistemic peer. In fact, that's extremely relevant in these conversations to understand who is an epistemic peer and what is the difference between peer disagreement and non-peer disagreement, right? This is actually a very important issue in literature on the epistemology of disagreement. So peer versus non-peer is important, but I just want to clarify one thing. Just because someone isn't your peer doesn't mean that they don't have the authority, the ability to engage with you in a meaningful way. This was another mistake in the paper that I think that Humer wrote. He tended to think that peer disagreement is where everything is, and it's not true, because one of the reasons why is that people who are not peers sometimes are still good at catching peers in their performance. Right?
Very good.
They understand
super helpful
criticism, but they don't understand content. They lack the content of the expert, but they have an idea of the general take. So they can catch certain general things and they can be good in that way. That's a mistake of thinking peer disagreement is the only thing. The second thing is, yes, it's important to recognize that sacred text might not be something you want to appeal to, but let's not take it in this sort of like fuzzy sort of certain way. Like it doesn't have to be that way. So there are some people who take the Kataka Samhita of Ayurveda to be very serious, and some of the people don't. I don't know. That's not really just looking at the text. I mean, there is some body of evidence of a certain kind that supports the use of these methods for health reasons. They just aren't in, peer-controlled replicated trials, clinical trials. So I just want to make it clear that, like, when I was talking about ancient wisdom and sacred texts, I didn't mean to appeal just to people saying the kind of thing you said about, Jesus will get me. That kind of thing is not actually relevant in the right way. We're talking about people who disagree ontologically about the nature of disease on the basis of a text that isn't part of modern day scientific investigation in the medicine, in the medical sciences. These are people who think, for example, that the disease model doesn't treat people holistically, And when you treat
Yep.
someone in a
Good.
psychosomatic way, it's relevant to understand disease from a psychosomatic perspective. And what they are trying to do is they're trying to say, we have textual evidence as well as folk traditions of healing people through these things that just haven't been studied through your method. So now let's get to your specific question. But I just wanted to make it clear, I don't think it's fair to lump those people in with the people who simply just say these things about, some higher power will get me through this and I'm just going to have faith in that. I don't want to talk about that because I have no expertise on that sort of understanding of it. But for me, there's definitely a separation between those people and the validity of appealing to, for example, turmeric as something that's valuable for your health prior to the modern day scientific investigations into
Absolutely.
to validate what these people were saying for thousands of years. So
to be fair, I wasn't trying to throw that debate under the bus or construe it in overly simplistic terms. What I was trying to do is just set up a contrast class and just say, relative to the problem space that we're in right now, the kinds of polarization that can happen when you have individuals or groups of individuals who disagree with each other about what proper outcomes look like on the basis of these kinds of more high level disagreement about what counts as an authority and what doesn't. To me, those types of disagreements are they're less central to the collective action problem that we currently face around vaccine hesitancy, because I submit, I think statistically speaking, a lot of what you're seeing in the polarization here is not about disagreements about what, whether a sacred text or versus scientific evidence. It's more about what kinds of testimony from whom ought to count as legislative and how much. Exactly.
Okay, so it's hard to actually say these things, but I think it is more central. I mean, that's what I'm going to also bet on here. Statistically, I'm not really 100% sure though that there aren't a fair amount of people. It's just that oftentimes those people just aren't part of the thing that we hear about. This is the problem of, there's always a lot more people out there than you think. You just don't hear a lot about them because they don't report themselves because they know they're not part of the epistemic culture issue. But anyway, putting that aside, let's get to your thing, because I definitely have something very powerful and helpful to say about that, which we already talked about. Look, there's this one person, I don't know who this person is, but let's just say, this one person has this one piece of evidence. He's obviously a qualified person. He came up with this technology and he's saying no. And several other people are saying, yes. Okay. So given the Condorcet jury theorem, there's not a problem here, right? I mean, how many people are saying yes versus how many people are saying no? Everyone has a better than 50% chance of being right. Is the argument here supposed to be that this one person has like a 99% chance of being correct and everyone else has like a 30% chance of being correct? And is that because he was the inventor of it? And then what we need to look at is what is the kind, now again, all my questions come right back. What is the kind of expertise that went into the invention that makes him more legitimate, the person to appeal to, than someone who didn't come up with the invention, but has worked in epidemiology for 30 years and published in all the leading journals and is a commentator and a person who is asked to sit on panels for public health across the United States of America? That is a precise question related directly to the issue you're talking about. And it's about weighting. So I mean, naively not knowing anything about this person, I would say it's very hard for me to believe that just because someone is the inventor, they have what we might say localized expertise on this sort of thing in a way that no one else has expertise that can override them. Because if everyone is sitting at 50% and this person's sitting at 99%, then the fact that these other people are going to come up with very powerful overriding defeaters in a way seems hard. I don't know where this person's stat, but I think one way to address this is, who are the panel of experts and what are their qualifications? What is the similarity between their qualifications and the domain to which this person created this specific intervention? And what is their ability to speak against it in a way where we account for political bias or political influence? So what we need to know, and again, this is where the performance problem comes in straightforwardly. We need these people who are saying, yes, it is safe, to be giving us their performance of their expertise independent of cognitive penetration from their political views. So here the concept of cognitive penetration would be the idea that in giving their testimony, something about their political beliefs are penetrating into their expertise testimony in a way that we recognize as being irrelevant. We don't care if they're Democrats or Republicans. We don't care what their political views are. We care about their ability to assess the scientific information and to tell us the status of it and to report that scientific testimony, to testify on the basis of that alone or with the minimal amount of penetration. So again, they won't function in the sphere of being people that are better than 50% correct in order for the Condorcet jury theorem to apply if what they're telling us is a bunch of politically motivated stuff. So we need this kind of like cognitively, not pure, but least tainted, cognitively least tainted testimony that speaks, and to have the interaction between the individual that disagrees. And this should be something that should be assessed in a public debate forum. It shouldn't be like a YouTube of this guy talking alone and everyone else not being there, and then these other people talking about, why don't they just all go on Joe Rogan? We'll have a great, watching them go at it, and we'll just hear about it. I mean, I think that's a nice way to do it. But I think that is fair, where then there can be individual assessors who have the ability to look at the status of what's going on. So that's what I would say. So again, I covered both sides. And so
you did.
I'm saying I do think there is a specific intervention and a thing going on. And I do think weighting does matter. And I think that's a little bit what we need to look at here.
For sure. Thank you. So I want to start inclining our collective attention towards wrapping this up. And there are sort of two things that I wanted to mention by way of sort of inclining towards a conclusion to the discussion. The first is one that just sort of came up for me spontaneously in response to what you were saying just now, especially when you name dropped Joe Rogan, because it's just an example, I think, of a very pernicious form of influence that I think dominates the way in which we psychologically take up with information without being, perhaps epistemically vigilant. So what I mean by that is just that as finite, emotional creatures, there are particular ways in which our capacity to absorb information is tweaked or is made more palatable by certain rhetorical techniques. Mm-hmm. So if you talk with a certain level of diction, speed, and volume, it will sound like what you're saying is true, even if what you're saying is nonsense. And this is how punditry works. This is how, news pundits and YouTube preachers make millions of dollars, is because they've learned certain techniques for public speaking that allow them to collect an audience. Because when we listen, when we put ourselves in a passive state or even an active state of listening and say, tell me something I want to hear, if that person has control over their voice and their posture and their eye contact and their volume, and they understand these basic mechanics of communicating with speech, you can get away with a lot.
Yes.
You can get away with so much. You can say so many terrible things, and people are like, well, he's clearly an authority on the matter. Yeah. And I just think that this is a worry that I have, well outside the scope of the particular question that we're trying to ask. And this leads to the second point, which is that the skill of rhetoric and the development of actual expertise are very different. And you can be an expert who's a terrible public speaker, and people will probably not take you very seriously. And you can be an absolute ham-fisted twit. But if you know how to speak, and you speak with the right tricks, people will take you very seriously. And so I guess this is just another place where the skeptical worry just creeps back in. It's like, who do I believe? What should I do about this? And, I'm happy that we converge on this topic at the end of our discussion, because this is my first foray into the Wild West of internet conversations.
But Sean, this is where you're pushing right now, to me, is also very important, because it is, look, so one of the issues that comes up here is, what does it mean when we're aware? When we're aware of certain biases, does that mean automatically that we can control them and make them go away? The answer is no.
That's right.
They undeniably come out and say that the answer, Anand believes the answer is no. Just because you're aware of stuff, it doesn't mean you can control it. Second question, should we investigate further into how awareness affects our ability to be unbiased? So for example, it might be true actually that the opposite holds, that because you're aware of it, you think, for example, that you're not going to be biased, but then you end up being more biased because you're overconfident and arrogant. And that could end up being true.
No doubt.
Something we need to look into more, and we need to, but I want to now end on, stop this part with a little bit of a positive thing. But these aren't arguments that tell me that awareness is useless. These are arguments that tell me it's misguided, that awareness is going to stop the problem, right? So what you're asking, what you're saying by telling people, should we know about the fact that who is speaking and how they're speaking might be part of what makes us take what they're saying seriously or not. I think, yeah, I'm going to tell people that. I mean, even if they can't stop that, because that's something that they can at least think about when they evaluate it at a later time, right? And I think these sorts of things are important. Like, one of the things in the bias area that I find myself very much leaning towards, that's also relevant to this conversation, is the fact that it's not very useful to be screaming about bias in a digital way. Like, oh my God, we need to get rid of, everyone has to be completely unbiased. Oh my God, there's still some bias here. The question is really to look at it mathematically and think about what's at stake, and think about what is the tolerance threshold that we can have in the relevant domain. We need to think effectively and very hard about how much is okay and why that amount is okay. And then we need to think about what we're doing and how our awareness can help us on one side or the other. So you're pointing to a fact that, look, if you know how to speak in certain ways, you're going to be able to convince people. I think that this is true, but I also think that when we increase the diversity of the audience, and the diversity here, I mean a very specific type of diversity. It's a diversity in critical thinking skills. It's a cognitive type of diversity involving critical thinking skills. The probability of the whole group as a whole being, I think I know it. It's Bob Marley. I think it's just a Bob Marley line. You can fool some people some of the time, but you can't fool all the people all of the time. It's the Bob Marley line, actually. I think awesome. Bob was a good epistemologist, actually.
Absolutely.
So Bob nailed it right here. I'm just twisting it in a different way by saying, when you have the right sort of cognitive diversity, the Bob Marley just got it right there. That's the point I want to make, right? So what I'm trying to say is that when we think about the way in which this sort of effect of voice and tone plays the role it does, remember that the way in which you're able to make your argument, Sean, is because of the audience relativity. All of a sudden, I stick your fancy high-speaking scientist in the middle of the Maori tribes in New Zealand, I'm not sure he doesn't come across as a buffoon, right? So again, this whole idea of this ability is context dependent. When we rotate the cognitive diversity in the audience, and those people have the ability to collectively dialogue, I think we then have an ability to control for that factor. Not control your individual cognition, but control in the group collective judgment. Problems of collective action oftentimes require problems of collective judgment. So the collective judgment helps with collective action, right? Because one of the components of collective action is collective belief, right? We want everyone to do F, but that requires that everyone believes that doing F is right. So there requires a judgment and evaluation collectively. So in order to get collective action off the ground, you have to solve something in the area of collective judgment. I think it trickles down. And in this way, I think this area, and I think one way to solve the specific problem you talked about, which I think might surprise you that I'm going to say this, is that when we have these people who are experts, who maybe people aren't listening to, and their voice needs to be heard. It's in fact, I think, the jobs of the philosophers to be the ones to go out and do that. I think that one thing that many philosophers are very good at is listening to voices that are not being heard, that might have something relevant to say, and figuring out how to repackage what they're saying in a way that is significant because of the very problem you're talking about. It's a unique skill to be trained as a cross-cultural philosopher, where your abilities and a multidisciplinary philosopher allow you to learn and acquire information from different areas in order to repackage it for groups that otherwise would not be able to understand why anyone would listen to anything anybody from this group is saying at all. I mean, you and I know we face this problem in the philosophy of mind all the time. I mean, people are looking at us like, I don't know why you pay attention to this stuff. And I'm like, okay, well, what if I put it to this? And we're like, oh, that's a pretty interesting idea, actually. Now that you said, I didn't know they were saying that. So this whole thing of learning, like what somebody who's worked on mRNA research for a long time, maybe at a school that's not very well recognized, but has worked hard, and having a philosopher of medicine come and sit down with them and listen and understand it, and then figuring out how to repackage it sounds to me like a perfectly good job description for a philosopher. I don't know. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I agree. I think that's very convincing, and I appreciate the perspective here. I think the last thing I want to do with you today is just sort of like kind of end where we began, and just because we sort of went into some fairly, I think, high-level philosophical analysis of the issue. But before we conclude our discussion today, I want to just sort of restate the problem and try and see if we could come up with, like, perhaps watering it down a little bit, but just say something to say something concrete between the two of us about how to try and address this problem. So, the question that we've tried to ask today is that how can we understand the difference between a fallacious appeal to authority and a rational trust of expertise? And I take it, for me, I think the thing that you said in response to this question that stuck with me the most is this idea of recognizing the weighting, not waiting in a room, but like the weighting of what people's expertise is, and to think about it in almost like a mathematical way. And that when we take seriously the aggregate opinion of authority figures who've done the work of developing certain levels of expertise, that is on its way to being a sufficient condition for having a rational trust and expertise.
Yeah, so I can definitely walk it through the sort of steps for me. It just goes back to my 3 questions. Who are the experts? Okay. Do you have evidence that suggests that one of these experts or many of them are not performing their expertise when their expertise was documented? And number 3, what is the weighting of each of the experts? And of course, anytime you look at weighting and aggregates, you have to have some aggregation.
Contrast class.
No, aggregation theorem. You have to have how do you aggregate those things? So there must be, but in the philosophy of this area, there are people who talk about aggregation, judgment aggregation all the time. So they can look. But I would think that those are the things. And now, of course.
But we also need a contrast class, right? Because that's how you're, yeah.
Right. And then the thing is, in identifying expertise, I think one of the things we have to do is we have to also look at what is the relevant credentials of the person relative to the task that they are making a judgment on. This is the part that makes for to make sure it's very clear. Remember, the fallacy is appeal to unqualified authority.
Yeah.
So the connection here must be from what are the credentials this person has to the task that they're asked for their authority on. And again, so that's why the second question comes in, because if you've satisfied the first part, they actually are relevant for the task at hand. Then the second thing is, was the thing that they delivered a function of just that or something else? That's the performance issue, right? Yeah. It is only if you satisfy the first 2 that you get to the third one, where then you have a weighting and then aggregation, right? So I think that's how I would look at the particular issue of this thing. So when your friend sends you those random YouTube videos, I think the quick response to that is this meant to be overriding or undermining? What are you trying to suggest to me with this one? Because one person's opinion alone is not how I'm going to make my decision, unless you're saying this person is the only person worth listening to.
Very good. All right, I think that's a great place to stop. So I've been talking today with Professor Anand Vaidya of San Jose State University from the philosophy department there. And Anand, thank you. That was a fantastic conversation. And I'm sure there'll be many more where this came from. Thank you for your time and your energy and your expertise.
All right. Thank you very much, Sean. Always a pleasure to talk to you.
Cheers.